Psychoanalysis, School Integration Series, second episode. In this series of school integration, we are trying to start off the grand enterprise of integrating various schools of psychoanalysis. In the first part, we saw the format which we are using for integration, that we start age-wise from 0 and go on till 5 and see how various schools of psychoanalysis look at the same period with different phenomena being in focus. And then we try to integrate it. The first episode was based upon the theme of the innate. And the second episode today is based on the theme of primary narcissism. Both these themes are precursors, so to say, of the real integration, which we will see by taking a look at the oral stage, anal stage, and phallic stage, 0 to 5, and how in each stage, say for example, in oral stage, Freud talks about the orality. Klein would talk about the paranoid schizoid and the depressive position, and Kohut would take the entire period from 0 to 3 and talk about early life difficulties of creating a healthy self. And Winnicott would talk about good enough mothering. And Jung would talk about the activation of age-appropriate archetypes. So we will start from the next episode with 0 to 2, 2 to 3.5, 3.5 to 5. We'll take Freud's psychosexual stages structure as the base and on a timeline see how we can integrate concepts and phenomena described by various schools. But before we start 0 to 2, 0 to 5, and we start with 0 to 2, before we do that, there are two episodes, last episode of the innate and today's episode of primary narcissism, which are like precursors to the enterprise that we will start from the next episode of starting from the oral stage, then going to the anal, then the phallic. So we are in the second part today of a precursor to the oral stage. The stage of primary narcissism has been described by Freud. This stage did not get much importance, neither by Freud himself in later theorizing, nor at the hands of other schools. However, this is a very important concept to be brought to the center stage. And therefore, one way to look at this concept is to say that you can look at this being a subset of the oral stage. But I have not done so because I think this merits a separate consideration as an independent phenomena, if not a stage. And today we'll take a look at this concept of primary narcissism and how we can do school integration in and around this concept. Freud talked of narcissism in two ways: primary narcissism and secondary narcissism. In fact, what usually colloquially and most pervasively when we refer to the word narcissism, by default, we refer to secondary narcissism. So when we don't qualify the word narcissism, we are using it as a synonym of secondary narcissism. Primary narcissism is by and large a forgotten term in psychoanalysis, and very unfortunately so. Let us look at how Freud differentiates primary narcissism from secondary narcissism. For Freud, in the first few days or weeks, the infant is not relating to any object outside or inside. He is in an oceanic state where only he exists. It is only I without any not I. I and not I has not yet come into existence. It is just I. And this oceanic state of only oneself existing and everything else being oceanically one, fused, kind of a universal fusion. That oceanic state is a state, according to Freud, of primary narcissism. This state is a pre-object stage. And in that sense, when we look at the psychosexual stages, the first stage logically should be primary narcissism. It should be 0 to say 2 weeks. And then oral state should, accurately speaking, precisely speaking, be from 2 weeks to 2 years, not actually 0 to 2. But Freud overlooks primary narcissism when he comes to the psychosexual structure of development and does not make a special place in terms of time for primary narcissism. But accurately speaking, precisely speaking, it should be 0 to 2 weeks or 1 week, whatever Freud says, is a stage of primary narcissism. And then from there, the oral stage begins till 2 years. In that sense, the first stage of psychosexual development in the Freudian scheme of things is the stage of primary narcissism, and oral stage, in fact, becomes the second stage. The primary narcissism stage, according to Freud, is not a pathology, it is a developmental stage. It becomes a pathology only if we get fixated there and we cannot move on to the next developmental stage. But this is a universal developmental stage through which everyone passes. This is not very different from Margaret Mahler's idea of everyone passing through a universal autism. So this, according to Freud, is the stage of primary narcissism. The feelings in this stage are of oneness with existence, an oceanic feeling, a feeling of ecstasy and bliss, a feeling of self-sufficiency, and feeling of one without the other. And there is a feeling of satisfaction of a very deep-seated desire in all of us, the urge to merge. That the urge to merge is definitely satisfied to its fullest possibility in the stage of primary narcissism. It's also accompanied by the feeling of bliss, at times the feeling of ecstasy, and at times a feeling of almost an orgasmic satisfaction. And these feelings we can see on the face of the child, in the whole body movements of the child. We may not be able to see if or not he feels the oceanic feeling, if he or not he is in a pre-object stage, but we can definitely see the feelings of ecstasy, bliss, self-sufficiency, of omnipotence. So this is the stage of primary narcissism. Secondary narcissism, according to Freud, and which is what mostly we call as narcissism, happens when the child tries to connect with all his emotions to the caregiver, but the caregiver is either cold or absent or attacking or unpredictable. And the reciprocation, the emotional reciprocation to the emotional advance from the child is inadequate and deeply frustrating and painful. That is where the cathexis, which was going towards the caregiver, it is frustrated, it cannot find an object or an adequately good object, it turns back, and cathexis happens of oneself because one could not find the other good enough to invest cathexis into. And this then leads to fragile and false feelings of self-sufficiency, grandiosity, omnipotence, and the difficulty of creating deeply meaningful emotional relationships in the outer world, although they may be very strong in the inner world. And this is the state of secondary narcissism. When we talk about narcissism in the sense of DSM, we are actually referring to secondary narcissism. So this is how Freud differentiates between the primary narcissism and the secondary narcissism. And the secondary narcissism can happen in the oral stage or in the phallic stage. Sorry, in the oral stage or in the anal stage. Most of the times it would be a 0 to 3.5 years phenomenon. Can happen later also, but most of the times it would be 0 to 3.5. Once we describe the stage of primary narcissism, it becomes important to mention that often we can see manifestations of both of them in some proportions. In the clinical setting, we can see somebody with DSM narcissism, the secondary narcissism, with characteristics of primary narcissism, which means part fixation is at the primary stage and part fixation is at the secondary stage. Second important point here is the difference between Freud and Klein on the concept of primary narcissism. Klein and object relations theorists, they don't believe that the stage of primary narcissism exists. For object relations theorists, human beings essentially are object creating, object relating creatures. And so if the object is not available in the outside world, we create it in fantasy. But the cognitive the psychic activity, be it cognitive or affective, essentially involves consideration of some object, direct or indirect, conscious or unconscious, explicit or implicit. So for object relations theorists, the stage of primary narcissism does not exist. And this is one of the many differences between Freud and Klein. recent studies of infants have shifted the matter slightly towards object relations and clients, where experimental observation tells us that human beings relate to objects as early as we can investigate them. However, I still believe there is merit in the idea of primary narcissism, and I'll come to it later when we try to integrate it. Third important element in this discussion is what the Jungian school would say, what Jung would say about primary narcissism. There are two ways from a Jungian standpoint we can approach this. One is there may be a idea of a pure self, and in early days of one's life, before the archetypal system is activated, it's only the pure self which is active, which is experienced as the state of primary narcissism, the oceanic state. So the oceanic state actually is the experience of the pure self before activation of the archetypal system. That is an explanation from the inside. That how do we explain the state of primary narcissism from Jung's model of the mind, going inside to the center of the model of the mind, the self. Another explanation from Jungian standpoint can be experience of that great unity, the unus mundus, the great unity of this entire system of existence. And somehow in those early days, we are able to experience this, which the crystallization of I and the crystallization of not I forever prohibits us from ever experiencing again. And unless this duality is transcended and the crystallized I in some way is transcended, this oceanic feeling can never be had again. Because primarily, the I and not I has to be transcended for this experience of onus mundus. Fourth important point in the context is of Kohut. How Kohut looks at narcissism, and he does not really go into the primary and the secondary, but just to have an idea of what he says. Kohut believes that the narcissism and exhibitionism are natural states of development, and if these states are not successfully passed through, a fixation happens and a pathology develops. But if you pass through these stages healthily, one gets past these stages. So he looks at narcissism essentially as a developmental arrest. And early in life, it is natural that one should pass through states of narcissism, grandiosity, exhibitionism. This is very near, and one thing common between Kohut, Freud, and Mahler is that a state of high self-sufficiency, a state of high intense feelings of satisfaction, happiness, and bliss. These states are natural states to occur. They are not contingent upon a pathological process, but are natural states through which one passes. So Freud's primary narcissism, Mahler's universal autism, and Kohut's natural narcissism are, one thing is common, they are natural states. And in these states, one feels a high degree of self-sufficiency, omnipotence, grandiosity, bliss. This is the common thing across the three of them. Now let us look at some other schools on the same theme of primary narcissism and then try to integrate it. The object clause, the Kleinian school or the object relation school, refers to the phenomena of narcissism as one of failure in object relations. This can mean object loss, presence of a bad object, or an unpredictable object. Focusing on the first aspect of object loss, there is a very large community of theorists who believe narcissism essentially as an outcome of early life object loss, where the cathexis returns onto the self. Cathexis, which was meant to happen on an object, the caregiver, returns onto the self because there is no object or no good enough object to actually hold, justify, or solicit that cathexis. I have created my own model of personality disorders. The model which describes the genesis of personality disorders. I call it the Valley Junction model. That's also based upon early life object loss, and it details out what happens after the object loss happens. What are the steps which happen one after another, resulting in narcissism, and difficult characteristics and effects which cohabit along with narcissism and which are seen as distressing to the individual and to those around him. So this is an object loss explanation of narcissism. And obviously this is referring to secondary narcissism because primary narcissism doesn't involve any object. There is a sixth point to be considered in this discussion that we are having. Experiences of spiritual nature, the experience of enlightenment. Entire Eastern spirituality is based on the concept of enlightenment. You can also call it the concept of liberation or the concept of freedom. And the state of enlightenment is described in great details in the Eastern spiritual literature. And some of the characteristics of this state of enlightenment are: one, it is an object-free state. Two, it is a state of no thought. Three, it is a state of high awareness. Four, it is a state of bliss or ecstasy. This is common to all states of all descriptions of enlightenment. There are some specific descriptions which are different. In some descriptions, it is a state of no affect. It is a state where pure affect can also be felt. It is a state of oceanic oneness. It is a state of all negating absolute. It is a state of just pure awareness and no affect, no cognition. So there are certain things which are common to all descriptions, certain things which are different. And based upon this, various descriptions of different descriptions of the state of enlightenment are given. Those who are interested can look at our discussion before called FAQ enlightenment, in which we have described different states which are all grouped together under the category word enlightenment. Now, some of the states of what is called as enlightenment are very near to the state of primary narcissism. And people make a mistake of equating the spiritual attainment with regression to infantile state. The two are very different. Primary narcissism is a pre-ego state, whereas enlightenment is a post-ego state. It comes only after the ego is transcended, if not permanently, at least temporarily. And the state of enlightenment comes after long effort, whereas the state of primary narcissism is a natural developmental state. The enlightenment state is not a natural developmental state. In fact, it's a very rare state achieved by very few individuals. We are referring to 1 in a 10 million kind of situation. What is common to the two states is you can experience an object-free state, you can experience bliss and ecstasy, you can experience oceanic oneness, or you can experience complete self-sufficiency. That is common between the spiritual state and of enlightenment and most of the spiritual states of enlightenment as described, not all of them, and the state of primary narcissism. So if we look at the state of enlightenment and you go through 8 to 10 definitions, almost 5 to 6 of them would have an overlap of considerable part with the state of primary narcissism. But of course, the two are completely different. It's like alpha and omega. You start with primary narcissism and end with the destination, the goal of enlightenment. It's almost like the beginning of the journey and the end of the journey. So once having taken a look at the concept of primary narcissism from different points, how do we integrate it? Let us first look at Freud and Klein. One way to look at it is that either of them is right. Either Freud is right or Klein is right. That may well be the case. We have to wait for future research to conclude with certitude. Or maybe both are right. If both are right, how do we integrate this? This seems to be more likely the case. That maybe instead of a stage, as Freud talks about, it may be a state. that there are states into which one goes, the states of primary narcissism in the first 2 or 3 weeks of life, where the oceanic oneness, the pre-object state, the feeling of ecstasy, bliss, omnipotence, and self-sufficiency, these things are active. So this may be a state within the oral stage, where apart from this state, there is also a state of object relations. But I still believe in the first few days, perhaps the state of primary narcissism would be primary, or maybe for the first few days, it may be the only state, but there's no way to know with certitude if it is so. But after a few days, as the object relations activity starts, definitely we can have a state and stage together, where the primary narcissism, instead of being a stage, is actually a state which activates, continues for some time, and then deactivates, giving way to state of object relations. So the state of primary narcissism and the state of object relations, they are alternating in the very early part of the oral stage. If we look at intrauterine activity, especially of twins, and they are relating to each other, then again the state of primary narcissism, if we call it a state and not a stage, it becomes more compatible with what we see. That even as the intrauterine twin relationships happen, if they do, the state of primary narcissism is always also there. So if we conceptualize that as state instead of a stage, it can be incorporated into the intrauterine in the early part of first few days of after birth, and also the early part of the oral stage. Is there a clinical manifestation of primary narcissism? Yes. There is a group of patients of psychosis in whom the regression to primary narcissism is very apparent. There is a happiness, a orgasmic bliss on their face, a shine on their face, almost a glow, which comes from regression to primary narcissism. It's almost like an post-orgasmic glow on the face. And I call that happy psychosis, where one does not want to come out of that state of regression, the state of blissful primary narcissism, into the reality which is painful. And despite the price in the real world, one is just not able to give up the addiction of the bliss of primary narcissism. One of the important points is it also leads us to what I call the bliss at the breast. And the bliss at the breast is experienced in two ways. One, there is a bliss with an all good object. And second, post that bliss, there is a regression to primary narcissism. So the bliss at the breast has an active bliss with the breast and a post stage. And the post state is actually a state of primary narcissism. So the bliss at the breast actually leads to experience of primary narcissism for some time. And it is to these two states, the bliss at the breast and the even earlier primary narcissism, is the state to which regression happens in happy psychosis. And this is a group which will not go for therapy, or if they go for therapy, they won't want to confront the core problem they have, or the difficulty of reality. So in all probability, they won't come, or if they come, the moment you start going to the core of the problem, they will leave therapy. They are happy in their happy psychosis. So God bless them. Thank you. So with this, we complete the two precursor discussions, one of the innate and the second of primary narcissism. Coming episode, we'll start the stage-wise integration of different schools. We'll start with the oral stage. Thank you.